A lot of the public discussion on freedom of speech in recent years has concerned the relationship between speech and money. I want to look at that relationship in this video. We'll start with the main argument that's at the core of this debate. We're going to assume that there's a right to freedom of speech. That is to say, the government may not take any action that would prevent you from speaking unless it serves a compelling government interest. For example, preventing you from revealing government secrets to a hostile country. This will add the premise that a lot of speech requires spending money. Of course, this isn't a universal law. One doesn't need money to talk to one's friend in the park. However, many forms of speech, such as taking out advertisements in newspapers or periodicals or online or on television, all cost money. Attending or hosting an event where one has an opportunity to speak in front of an audience costs money. Hiring the expertise of a public relations firm that will package and distribute one's message in its most effective form costs money. The fact that many forms of speech requires money implies that if you restrict a person's freedom to spend money, then you restrict a person's freedom of speech. So if restricting a person's freedom to spend money on speech violates their right to freedom of speech, and if people actually have a right to freedom of speech, then people have a right to spend money on speech. Okay, so here's a problem. Candidate 1 is running for office. Now, I have a right to tell people that I favor this candidate, or I think the other candidate should be defeated. And if I have a right to say this, then I have a right to buy advertisements, create pamphlets, produce and advertise an online video, create and fund a website, or do any number of things to express that opinion. And note, I'm not talking about giving the candidate a campaign contribution. For the purposes of this discussion, I won't be giving the candidate a dime. My money goes to fund an independent organization that delivers a message that this is the better candidate. Any candidate can figure out what they need to do to get me to donate my money to an organization that'll support their candidacy. We don't need emails or telephone calls that involve explicit promises, no evidence of bribery. The candidate simply announces that they support this policy or opposes that policy, and then the money shows up in the account of the relevant supporting organization. The more money I have, the more influential I can expect to be over any candidate's policies. If all I can promise is $25 if they support the policies I favor, no candidate's going to give my opinion much weight. If I have tens of millions of dollars to spend, candidates are going to pay more attention. With these ideas in mind, I want to look at the case of Citizens United versus the Federal Elections Commission, the FEC for short. We'll start with the facts of the case. An organization named Citizens United created a movie called Hillary, the Movie, to attack Hillary Clinton, the presumed Democratic nominee in the 2008 presidential election. Turns out that the presumption was a bit premature. Barack Obama won the nomination, but that's beside the point. There was a law in the books at the time called the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, or the McCain-Feingold Act, named after the two key sponsors, one Republican and one Democrat. That law stated that no corporation or union could spend money on any electioneering communication within 60 days of a general election or 30 days of a primary election. Again, we're not talking about direct campaign contributions here. We're talking about paying for material supporting or opposing a candidate by independent organizations. Specifically, Citizens United offered to pay a pay-per-view video distribution service $1.2 million to make their movie available to its subscribers for free. To raise the money, they accepted some contributions from for-profit companies. Yet, because of the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, this was a felony. The use of corporate money to fund a message saying that a candidate ought to be defeated within 30 days of a primary election was prohibited under the law. For those 30 days, only individuals could legally spend money to express a political opinion on a candidate. Corporations could not. The court ruled that a prohibition on expressing an opinion on a candidate violated the right to freedom of speech. If any speech warranted protection, speech about the merits of a candidate was certainly high on the list. Here are some other relevant points. Under the McCain-Feingold Act, there were cases where people were uncertain whether their advertisement or message was of a prohibited type. Would a mailing that showed how an incumbent voted on a select list of laws be considered purely informative, or was it an attempt to sway voters? Under the law, people were advised to send their political advertisements to the government for a preliminary judgment. In other words, people were advised to submit their political ads to the government for approval if they didn't want to risk criminal penalties. So, according to the Supreme Court majority opinion, quote, thus the following acts would all be felonies under 441B. The Sierra Club runs an ad within the crucial phase of 60 days before the general election that exhorts the public to disapprove of a congressman who favors logging in national forests. The National Rifle Association publishes a book urging the public to vote for the challenger because the incumbent U.S. senator supports a handgun ban. Or the American Civil Liberties Union creates a website telling the public to vote for a presidential candidate in light of that candidate's defense of free speech. These prohibitions are classic examples of censorship. Here, then, is the free speech argument. In a previous video in this series, I argued that the effect of censorship is to control the listener by controlling the information that the listener is provided. The effect of this law is to prohibit corporations from talking to voters about political matters for 30 days prior to a primary election or 60 days prior to a general election. It was an absolute prohibition on a corporation spending any money during that time mentioning any candidate. Any law that prohibits political speech is subject to what the court calls strict scrutiny. The government must show that they have a compelling state interest to restrict this speech. The law has to address a legitimate government concern, and it has to do so in the least intrusive way. Preventing voters from being persuaded to cast their votes one way or another as a result of political speech is not a legitimate state interest. The McCain-Feingold law functioned to restrict corporations from having an influence on how people vote. And barring speech because it might produce an influence on how people vote is a violation of the right to freedom of speech. Therefore, according to the majority opinion, a law prohibiting corporations from talking to voters on political matters in the days before an election because it might sway their vote violates the right to freedom of speech. So I want to make sure we remember what the argument was on the other side. It's that government does have a compelling state interest in fighting government corruption. The compelling state interest is in creating a government that serves the voters rather than serving the interests of the largest contributors. Now, one of the arguments one might hear states that corporations don't have rights to express opinions on political matters. Only individuals have that right. The response to this objection asks if an individual loses their right to express an opinion on political matters if they decide to work with another person rather than alone, because that's all a corporation is, a group of people working on a common project. According to the Supreme Court, a group of people who form a corporation to speak with one voice do not, by doing so, lose their right to speak on political matters. Now, this brings up a second issue with respect to money and free speech. So let's begin by taking a look at the premise. If you limit a person's ability to spend money, then you limit a person's ability to speak. This means that limiting a person's freedom to buy advertisements, distribute mailings or books or movies, or doing other things to express an opinion that costs money limits a person's freedom to express an opinion. Well, one of the things that can happen when you use money to express an opinion is that you can block other people from expressing their opinion. Let me illustrate. Assume that there's an open political event and there are 20 speaking slots available, 30 minutes each, from 10 o'clock a.m. until 8 o'clock p.m. And these slots are put up for auction. A wealthy individual then buys all 20 slots and gives those slots to people who will agree to speak in favor of the donor's preferred candidate. Now, they've used their money in order to buy up opportunities to speak. Reducing their right to spend money would limit them in their ability to speak. But notice, they have also successfully prevented everybody else from speaking. By effectively cornering the market on speaking opportunities, they have, for all practical purposes, silenced everybody who would speak against them. The argument here is that people with money are drowning out the voices of those without money. The regular voter can't be heard outside of a circle of a few friends and followers on social media, at least not unless they first find themselves a corporate sponsor to fund them. Ask yourself if your political voice would be louder if you had $10 million to spend on making yourself heard. This suggests that unlimited spending on political speech can have the effect of silencing all voices that have little or no money to spend on political speech. And this, it can be argued, is a kind of censorship. So in summary, I've sought to look at some of the concerns relating money to speech. We have the principle that limiting a person's ability to spend money on speech is equivalent to limiting their freedom to speak. If there is a right to speak, then there's a right to spend money on speech. People don't give up this right when they decide to work together in a corporation and speak with a common voice. At the same time, there's a legitimate interest in having a government that serves the interests of the people and not the interests of the wealthiest speakers. And there's a concern that one of the effects of allowing unlimited spending on speech is that, for all practical purposes, only those with money have a useful freedom of speech.